So here's something worth thinking about tonight. At some point in the next few hours, if you haven't already started drifting, something extraordinary is going to happen inside your head. Your brain is going to build a world. Not a vague, foggy impression of a world, a full, immersive, three-dimensional reality, complete with people you recognize, places that feel familiar even if they don't actually exist, sounds, textures, emotions so vivid they can wake you up with your heart pounding. You'll believe it completely while it's happening. You won't question the talking dog or the fact that your childhood kitchen is somehow also an airport. You'll just go with it, fully absorbed, living inside a hallucination that your own mind is constructing in real time, from scratch, with no script and no director. And then, most likely, you'll forget the whole thing by morning. That's dreaming. And it is, when you really sit with it, one of the strangest things that any brain does. Stranger than memory, stranger than language. Because dreaming means that every night, the same organ that balances your checkbook and reminds you to buy milk also moonlights as a surrealist filmmaker with an unlimited budget and absolutely no concern for plot coherence. And the truly wild part is that after thousands of years of wondering about it, after decades of serious neuroscience, after we've mapped the human genome and photographed black holes and built machines that can beat us at chess, we still don't fully understand why we dream. We have theories, good ones, competing ones, theories that explain some of it beautifully and leave other parts a mystery. But a complete, settled, everyone agrees answer? We're not there yet, and that's what we're going to explore tonight. The whole tangled, fascinating story of dreams. What they are, how they work, why your brain bothers generating them at all, and what the best science of the last 150 years has been able to figure out. We're going to take our time with it. We'll start with the ancient world, because people have been trying to make sense of dreams for as long as there have been people. We'll meet the scientists who first figured out how to study sleep in a laboratory, the ones who discovered the bizarre eye movements that would crack open the whole field, the psychologists who built grand theories that collapsed, and the neuroscientists who are still, right now, arguing about what it all means. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. That's actually kind of the point. The ideas will still be here, and honestly, given the subject matter, falling asleep in the middle of a story about dreams feels almost poetically appropriate. Let's start where the story starts, which is basically everywhere, all at once. Because dreaming is one of those universal human experiences that every culture in recorded history has tried to explain. And the explanations people came up with tell you as much about the culture as they do about dreams. The ancient Mesopotamians, we're talking 3,000 to 4,000 years before the Common Era, took dreams incredibly seriously. They had dream interpreters attached to royal courts, specialized priests, whose entire job was to decode what the gods were saying through the king's dreams. They believed that during sleep, the soul actually left the body and traveled to other realms. What you experienced in a dream wasn't a hallucination. It was a real journey. Some of the oldest surviving literary works, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2100 BCE, feature dreams as major plot points. Gilgamesh dreams of a meteor falling from the sky before he meets his great companion Enkidu. The dream is prophetic. It announces what's coming. The Egyptians had a similar framework. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, dating to around 1275 BCE, is essentially one of the oldest dream interpretation guides we have. Hundreds of dream scenarios and their meanings. The Greeks took this even further. On one hand, you had temples of Asclepius, the god of healing, where sick people would sleep overnight, hoping the god would visit them in a dream and cure them. On the other hand, You had Aristotle, and this is remarkable for the 4th century BCE, arguing that dreams were not divine messages at all. In his short work on dreams, he proposed that dreams were caused by residual sensory impressions that lingered in the mind after the senses shut down during sleep. He noticed that dreams often incorporated recent experiences and that your body's physical state could influence them. If you were too warm, you might dream of fire. Aristotle was essentially describing what we now call the continuity hypothesis and the influence of somatic stimuli on dream content, two ideas contemporary sleep researchers take very seriously. He got there 2,400 years early. But here's the thing about Aristotle's cool rationalism. It didn't win the day. Not for a long time. The prophetic view of dreams, the idea that they carry messages from gods or spirits or the universe or the future, was simply too compelling, too deeply embedded in human psychology. And honestly, you can understand why. Dreams feel meaningful. They arrive unbidden, vivid, emotionally charged, full of symbols that seem to be pointing at something. When you dream about a loved one who's died, or about a disaster that then actually happens, and given enough dreams over a lifetime, coincidences like that are statistically inevitable. The temptation to read cosmic significance into it is overwhelming. We're pattern-seeking animals. We look for meaning even when there is none. And dreams are the ultimate Rorschach test, ambiguous enough to support almost any interpretation you want to project onto them. For the next 2,000 years or so, the story of dreams is mostly a story of interpretation. Roman dream analysis, medieval Christian dream theology, Islamic dream interpretation, entire scholarly traditions built around decoding what dreams mean, with the underlying assumption that they mean something intentional, something directed. In the Islamic world, dream interpretation became a sophisticated discipline, with scholars like Ibn Sirin in the 8th century producing dream dictionaries consulted for centuries. In medieval Christian Europe, Thomas Aquinas argued that while God could certainly communicate through dreams, most dreams were caused by natural stimuli, and using them for divination was sinful, a position somewhere between Aristotle's rationalism and popular belief. But what nobody was doing, for all those centuries, was studying dreams scientifically. Nobody was measuring anything. Nobody was asking, what is actually happening in the brain and body when a person dreams? That question couldn't even be properly formulated until people had some basic understanding of the nervous system, of the brain as the organ of the mind, of the difference between sleep and waking as physiological states rather than spiritual conditions. And that understanding didn't really begin to develop until the 19th century, when a few curious researchers started doing something that sounds obvious, but was actually quite radical. They started watching people sleep, carefully, systematically, with instruments. And this is where the story shifts from philosophy and theology to something recognizably scientific, and it starts, as so many stories in the history of science do, with someone paying attention to something everyone else had overlooked. Because sleep, for most of human history, was considered boring, blank, a kind of nightly death. Your mind switched off, your body recharged, and then you woke up. The interesting part was the dreams, sure, but sleep itself? Sleep was nothing, an absence, a gap in consciousness. The first cracks in that view appeared in the late 19th and early 20th century. Researchers noticed that sleep wasn't a uniform state. People moved during sleep. They changed positions. Their breathing patterns shifted. Their muscle tension varied. If you sat by someone's bedside all night and took careful notes, which a few dedicated researchers actually did, you'd see that sleep had a kind of architecture, a rhythm. It wasn't a flat line. It was more like a landscape with hills and valleys. But the real breakthrough, the one that would transform sleep science from a backwater into a thriving field and give us our first real window into the biology of dreaming, came from electricity. Specifically, from the discovery that the brain generates measurable electrical signals, and that these signals change dramatically depending on whether you're awake, lightly asleep, or deeply asleep. And the person who made this discovery, the person who first successfully recorded the electrical activity of the human brain, was a German psychiatrist named Hans Berger, working in Jena in the 1920s. And his story, the story of how he came to even attempt this, is one of those beautiful human tales that reminds you how science actually happens, not through cold logic, but through obsession, intuition, and sometimes very personal motivations that have nothing to do with science at all. Berger was born in 1873 in Neuss, a small town in Bavaria. He was a quiet, meticulous man, methodical to the point of compulsiveness, the kind of researcher who took detailed notes on everything and trusted nobody else's measurements. And here's the thing about what drove him into brain research. It was a personal experience, something that happened when he was a young man doing his military service. He was riding a horse during an artillery exercise, and the horse reared, throwing him directly into the path of a horse-drawn cannon. He narrowly escaped being crushed. That same evening, his sister, who was miles away, sent an urgent telegram to their father, saying she had a sudden, overwhelming feeling that Hans was in danger and needed to know if he was all right. She had never done anything like that before, not just by the near-death experience, but by the coincidence, the fact that his sister had sensed his distress at apparently the same moment it happened. And rather than dismissing it as chance, he became consumed by the question, is there some form of psychic energy that the brain generates, some signal that could be transmitted between minds? He spent the next several decades trying to detect this energy. He never found telepathy, obviously, but in the process of looking for it, he found something far more important. He found brain waves. In 1924, after years of painstaking work, Berger succeeded in recording the first human electroencephalogram, the EEG. He placed electrodes on the scalps of patients, including his own son, and measured the tiny electrical voltages produced by the brain. And he found something remarkable. The brain produced rhythmic electrical patterns, and these patterns changed depending on the person's state. When someone was awake and relaxed with their eyes closed, the EEG showed a regular, rhythmic pattern at about 10 cycles per second, what Berger called alpha waves. When they opened their eyes or started concentrating on something, the pattern shifted to faster, more irregular activity, beta waves. And when they fell asleep, the patterns changed again, becoming slower, larger, and more synchronized. Berger published his findings in 1929, and the scientific community's reaction was skepticism, a lot of skepticism. Many people thought he was picking up electrical artifacts, muscle twitches, heartbeat interference, anything but actual brain signals. It took several years, and independent confirmation by Edgar Adrian and B.H.C. Matthews at Cambridge in 1934, before the scientific world accepted that yes, you could actually record the brain's electrical activity through the skull. But once they accepted it, the implications were enormous. For the first time, you had a tool that could tell you something about what the brain was doing while a person was asleep, without waking them up. You could literally watch the sleeping brain work. And that tool would, within a few decades, lead to a discovery so unexpected, so fundamentally surprising, that it would rewrite everything scientists thought they knew about sleep and open up an entirely new chapter in the science of dreams. But the person who made that discovery wasn't Berger. It was a graduate student in Chicago, working in a cramped laboratory in the early 1950s, and the story of how he stumbled onto one of the most important findings in the history of neuroscience starts, wonderfully, with a professor who had a question about sleeping babies and a rather unusual curiosity about their eyelids. The professor's name was Nathaniel Kleitman, and he was, by the early 1950s, the undisputed father of modern sleep research. Kleitman had been studying sleep at the University of Chicago since the 1920s, longer than almost anyone else in the world. He was a Russian-born physiologist who had emigrated to the United States as a young man, and he had spent decades doing the kind of unglamorous, painstaking work that eventually builds an entire field. He studied how long people could stay awake, how sleep deprivation affected performance, how the body's internal clock regulated sleep-wake cycles. In 1938, he and a colleague, Bruce Richardson, actually spent 32 days living in Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, deep underground, in constant darkness, with no external cues about time of day, to study whether the human body had an internal clock that would persist without sunlight. It did. Kleitman's body stubbornly maintained something close to a 24-hour cycle, even in total darkness, which was an important early piece of evidence for what we now call the circadian rhythm. But by the early 1950s, Kleitman was interested in something more specific. He'd noticed that sleeping infants sometimes moved their eyes in a particular way, not the slow, rolling movements that people had casually observed before, but rapid, darting movements, almost like the eyes were watching something. He wondered whether these movements occurred in specific patterns, whether they were associated with particular stages of sleep, and what, if anything, they meant. He assigned the question to one of his graduate students, a young man named Eugene Asarinsky. Now, Asarinsky is one of those figures in science who deserves far more recognition than he gets. He was not, by conventional measures, a star student. He was in his 30s by the time he started graduate work. He was perpetually short of money, and his early career had been rocky. But he was observant, he was persistent, and Kleitman had given him a question that turned out to be one of those rare questions where the answer is far more important than anyone expected. Asarinsky started by observing sleeping infants, watching for eye movements, and trying to correlate them with other physiological changes. But infant studies were difficult to control, so he eventually switched to studying sleeping adults, hooking them up to EEG machines, and also placing electrodes near their eyes to measure eye movements, a technique called electrooculography. And what he found, over many nights of tedious observation, recording, and analysis, changed everything. He discovered that during sleep, people periodically entered a distinct and peculiar state. Their eyes would begin darting rapidly back and forth under their closed lids. Quick, sharp, conjugate movements, nothing like the slow rolling of the eyes when you first drift off. And when he looked at the EEG during these episodes, he saw something bizarre. The brain's electrical activity looked almost identical to the waking state. Fast, low voltage, desynchronized, the kind of brain activity you'd expect from someone who was wide awake and actively engaged with the world. But these people were asleep. Deeply asleep, in fact. They were actually harder to wake than people in other stages of sleep, despite the fact that their brains appeared to be buzzing with activity. Asarinsky didn't know what to make of this at first. He thought the equipment might be malfunctioning. He checked the connections, replaced the electrodes, made sure nothing was loose. The readings persisted, so he did something simple and brilliant. He started waking people up during these episodes of rapid eye movement and asking them what was happening. And the answer, overwhelmingly, was they were dreaming. Not just vaguely, vividly, elaborately, full narrative dreams, dense with imagery and emotion, the kind of dreams you remember. Then he woke people up during other stages of sleep, the quieter stages without the rapid eye movements, and asked the same question. Sometimes they reported something, fragments, vague thoughts, a sense that something had been happening, but nothing like the rich, immersive dream reports from the rapid eye movement periods. The correlation was dramatic and clear. Wake someone up during rapid eye movements and you'll get a dream. Wake them up during quiet sleep and usually you won't. Aserinsky and Kleitman published their findings in 1953 in the journal Science. The paper was just 2 pages long. It announced the existence of a previously unknown, regularly occurring stage of sleep characterized by rapid eye movements and a brain state resembling wakefulness, and it reported a strong correlation between this stage and dreaming. The stage would eventually be called REM, for rapid eye movement. Everything else would be called non-REM sleep, or NREM. Here's the thing about this discovery. It's hard to overstate how fundamentally it changed the landscape. Before Aserinsky and Kleitman, dreaming was a purely psychological phenomenon. It was Freud's territory, philosophy's territory, the domain of interpretation and speculation. There was no way to study it biologically. You couldn't point to a moment in the night and say, "There, that's when the dreaming is happening." But after 1953, you could. You had a physiological marker. You could see it on the EEG. You could predict when someone was dreaming, confirm it by waking them up, and start studying the biology of dreaming in real time. It was like discovering that thunder and lightning are the same event. Suddenly, 2 things that had seemed separate were connected, and you had a bridge between the subjective experience of dreams and the objective activity of the brain. And the details that emerged about REM sleep, as researchers started investigating it more carefully in the years that followed, were genuinely strange. A student of Kleitman's named William Dement, who would go on to become one of the most famous sleep researchers in the world, sometimes called the father of sleep medicine, began systematically mapping the architecture of a night's sleep, and what he found was that sleep follows a remarkably consistent pattern, cycling through distinct stages in a predictable sequence. Here's how it works, and this is worth understanding because it tells you a lot about what your brain is actually up to right now, if you're starting to drift off. When you first fall asleep, you enter what's called Stage 1 NREM sleep. It's light, transitional. You're technically asleep, but you can be woken easily. Your brain waves start slowing down from the rapid, irregular beta waves of wakefulness to the slightly slower, more rhythmic alpha waves, and then slower still. You might experience hypnagogic hallucinations at this point, brief, vivid fragments of imagery that aren't quite dreams, a flash of a face, a sense of falling. That sudden jerk that startles you awake, the one that feels like you tripped on a curb. That's called a hypnic jerk, and it's incredibly common. Your muscles are relaxing, your brain is shifting gears, and occasionally the signals get a little garbled during the transition. Then you slide into Stage 2, which is still considered light sleep but is more stable. Your brain waves slow further, and 2 distinctive features appear on the EEG: sleep spindles, which are brief bursts of rapid activity, and K-complexes, which are large, sharp waveforms. Sleep spindles, in particular, turn out to be fascinating. They seem to play a role in memory consolidation, which we'll talk about later. You spend a lot of your night in Stage 2, roughly half, in fact. From Stage 2, you descend into Stage 3, which is deep sleep, also called slow-wave sleep. This is the heavy stuff. Your brain waves become large, slow, and synchronized, delta waves, oscillating at just 1 to 4 cycles per second. Your body is deeply relaxed. Your heart rate and blood pressure drop. Growth hormone is released. This is the stage where your body does its most serious repair work: tissue growth, immune function, all the housekeeping that requires you to be profoundly still and unconscious. It's also the hardest stage to wake up from. If someone shakes you awake during deep, slow-wave sleep, you'll feel groggy, disoriented, almost drunk. Sleep researchers call that sleep inertia, and it can take 30 minutes or more to fully clear. So you've gone down. Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3. You've descended into deep sleep. And then, after about 70 to 90 minutes, something happens. Your brain starts climbing back up. You pass through Stage 2 again. But instead of waking up, your brain does something completely unexpected. It shifts into a state that looks, on the EEG, almost identical to being awake. Fast, desynchronized, active. Your eyes start darting around, your breathing becomes irregular, your heart rate picks up, and your voluntary muscles, the ones that move your limbs, become almost completely paralyzed. Essentially, your brain turns on, your body turns off, and you start dreaming. That's REM sleep. And that combination, an active brain in a paralyzed body, is one of the most peculiar biological states in all of nature. Think about what's happening. Your brain is generating vivid, immersive hallucinations. It's activating emotional centers, visual processing areas, motor planning regions. If you were awake and your brain were doing this, you'd be running, fighting, flying, falling. But you can't move because your brainstem is actively suppressing signals to your muscles. It's called REM atonia, and it's a safety mechanism. It keeps you from acting out your dreams. Without it, you'd be thrashing, walking, possibly injuring yourself or someone next to you. And in fact, there's a condition called REM sleep behavior disorder, most common in older adults, where this paralysis fails, and people literally act out their dreams, punching, kicking, leaping out of bed. It can be dangerous, and it turns out to be an important early warning sign for certain neurodegenerative diseases, which we'll come back to. Now this cycle, NREM stages descending into deep sleep, then back up and into REM, repeats throughout the night. But the proportions shift. Early in the night, the cycles are dominated by deep, slow-wave sleep. The first REM period is short, maybe 10 minutes. But as the night goes on, the deep sleep diminishes, and the REM periods get longer. By the last couple of hours before you wake up, you're spending most of your time in Stage 2 and REM, and those final REM periods can last 30 to 45 minutes. This is why your most vivid, most elaborate, most memorable dreams tend to happen toward the end of the night, in the early morning hours. The REM periods are longer, the dreams have more time to develop, and you're closer to waking, which makes you more likely to remember them. And here's something interesting that Dement noticed early on. People don't just have REM periods on some random schedule. The cycle is remarkably regular, about 90 minutes, give or take, from the start of one cycle to the next. You'll go through 4 to 6 of these cycles in a typical night, and this 90-minute rhythm doesn't just disappear when you wake up. There's evidence that it continues throughout the day, manifesting as subtle fluctuations in alertness and attention. Some researchers call it the basic rest activity cycle, or BRAC, and while it's subtler and harder to measure during waking hours, it suggests that the brain's tendency to cycle through different states is a fundamental feature of how it operates, not just something it does during sleep. Now, the discovery of REM sleep didn't just give scientists a tool for studying dreams. It also raised a whole set of new questions that nobody had even thought to ask before. Questions like, is REM sleep necessary? What happens if you deprive someone of it? Do all animals do it? What parts of the brain generate it, and how? And most fundamentally, why? Why does the brain do this? Why does it generate this peculiar active brain, paralyzed body state every 90 minutes? What purpose does it serve? Dement was one of the first to tackle the deprivation question. In the late 1950s, he conducted experiments where he monitored sleeping subjects and woke them up every time they entered REM sleep, effectively preventing them from dreaming while allowing them to get plenty of NREM sleep. The results were striking. Over several nights of REM deprivation, the subjects began entering REM sleep more and more frequently. The brain was fighting back, trying harder and harder to get into that state. By the fifth night, Dement had to wake some subjects 20 or 30 times to prevent REM. And when he finally let them sleep undisturbed, they showed a dramatic REM rebound, spending far more time in REM than normal, as if the brain were catching up on missed dream time. The subjects also reported feeling irritable, anxious, and having difficulty concentrating during the day. This suggested that REM sleep wasn't just an incidental quirk. It was something the brain actively needed, something it would fight to get, and that implied it was serving some important function. But what? And that question, what function, is the one that has generated more debate, more competing theories, more passionate arguments among sleep researchers than almost any other question in the field. It's the question that connects the biology we've just walked through to the ancient puzzle we started with. Why do we dream? Because if REM sleep is when most vivid dreaming occurs, and if the brain needs REM sleep badly enough to fight for it, then the function of REM sleep and the function of dreaming might be deeply intertwined. Maybe we dream because of what REM sleep is doing, or maybe dreaming is what REM sleep is for. Or maybe, and this is a possibility we need to take seriously, dreaming and REM sleep are related but not identical, and asking why we dream is a different question from asking why we need REM sleep. But before we can really dig into those theories, we need to talk about the person who, for better or worse, dominated the conversation about dreams for the better part of a century. A person whose theory of dreaming is so famous that for many people, it is the theory of dreaming, the only one they've ever heard of. A person whose ideas were brilliant, provocative, wildly influential, and, according to most modern neuroscientists, largely wrong. I'm talking about Sigmund Freud and his story, his obsession with dreams, his grand theory of the unconscious, and the way that theory eventually collided with the hard realities of brain science, is one of the most fascinating and contentious chapters in the history of psychology. Because Freud didn't just have a theory about dreams. He believed dreams were the key to understanding the human mind itself. He called his 1899 book on the subject, published with a 1900 date, because he liked the symbolism of ushering in a new century, the interpretation of dreams. And in the preface, he made a claim that was either visionary or grandiose, depending on your point of view. He wrote that the interpretation of dreams is the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind. The royal road, not a road, the road. Dreams, for Freud, weren't just interesting. They were the single most important window into the hidden workings of the psyche. Here's what Freud believed, and I want to lay it out fairly, because even if much of it doesn't hold up under modern scientific scrutiny, it's a genuinely fascinating intellectual construction. Freud proposed that dreams are, at their core, wish fulfillments. Every dream, he argued, represents the fulfillment of an unconscious wish, usually one that's too disturbing, too socially unacceptable, too threatening to the ego to be acknowledged in waking life. These wishes are typically rooted in childhood experiences and are often sexual or aggressive in nature. During waking hours, a psychic mechanism Freud called the censor keeps these wishes repressed, safely locked away in the unconscious. But during sleep, the censor relaxes. The forbidden wishes start to push toward consciousness. And the mind, in a kind of compromise, allows them to surface, but only in disguised form. That disguise is the dream. So, in Freud's framework, every dream has two layers. There's the manifest content, what the dream appears to be about on the surface, the story, the images, the events you'd describe if someone asked you what you dreamed. And then there's the latent content, the hidden meaning underneath, the unconscious wish that the dream is actually expressing. The process that transforms the latent content into the manifest content is what Freud called dream work, and it involves several specific mechanisms. Condensation, where multiple ideas or images are compressed into a single dream element. Displacement, where the emotional charge of a threatening wish is transferred to something innocuous. Symbolization, where abstract ideas are represented by concrete images. And yes, this is where all those Freudian dream symbols come from, the ones people joke about. Freud believed that certain dream images had more or less universal symbolic meanings, often related to sexuality. Elongated objects, staircases, weapons. You can fill in the rest. Now, here's the thing about Freud's theory. It's internally coherent. If you accept the premises, the whole system hangs together beautifully. But here's the problem. And this is a problem that goes to the heart of what separates science from other ways of understanding the world. Freud's theory is almost impossible to test. If you dream about a train entering a tunnel, and Freud says that symbolizes something sexual, how do you prove him wrong? If you insist the dream was just about a train, he can say you're resisting the interpretation. If you dream about something that doesn't seem to fulfill any wish, he can invoke increasingly convoluted explanations. It's a punishment wish, a counter-wish, a wish to prove the theory wrong. There's always an escape hatch. The philosopher Karl Popper used Freud's theory as one of his primary examples of a non-falsifiable theory, one that can't be proven wrong because it can explain everything, which actually means it explains nothing. That doesn't make Freud a fraud. He was a brilliant clinical observer, and some of his broader insights, that unconscious processes influence behavior, that childhood experiences shape personality, that people deceive themselves about their own motivations. These have been supported by modern psychology. But his dream theory specifically? Most neuroscientists today consider it largely unsupported. Not because it's crazy, but because better explanations exist, grounded in what we actually know about brain activity during sleep. And the person who really lit the fuse on the modern critique of Freud's dream theory, who went further than just questioning it and offered a radically different account of why we dream, was a psychiatrist at Harvard named J. Allen Hobson. And Hobson's theory, which he first proposed in 1977 alongside his colleague Robert McCarley, didn't just disagree with Freud. It turned the entire framework upside down. Where Freud said, dreams are meaningful messages from the unconscious that need to be decoded, Hobson said, dreams are essentially the brain's attempt to make sense of random neural noise. The meaning isn't hidden in the dream. The meaning is generated by the brain's storytelling machinery, working desperately to impose narrative order on what is, at bottom, neurological chaos. They called it the activation synthesis hypothesis, and here's how it works. During REM sleep, the brainstem, specifically a region called the pons, generates essentially random electrical signals that activate various parts of the cortex. These signals aren't carrying any information in the way that signals from your eyes or ears carry information during waking life. They're just noise, spontaneous firing patterns with no coherent content. But the forebrain, the cortical regions that handle perception and cognition and narrative, doesn't know that. It receives these signals and does what it always does. It tries to make a story out of them. It synthesizes. It takes the random activations, a burst of activity in the visual cortex here, an emotional surge from the amygdala there, a fragment of motor cortex activation somewhere else, and it weaves them into a narrative. That narrative is the dream. Think about what this means. In Hobson and McCarley's view, the bizarreness of dreams isn't the result of a cunning censor disguising forbidden wishes. It's the result of the forebrain doing its best to construct a coherent story from fundamentally incoherent input. The reason dreams are strange is that the raw material is strange. Random activations that don't form any natural pattern. The brain is improvising, making it up as it goes, and since the inputs are chaotic, the output is often chaotic too. The flying, the shape-shifting, the impossible transitions from one scene to another, these aren't symbols. They're artifacts of the brain trying and failing to impose order on disorder. This was explosive stuff when it was published. Hobson was basically saying that Freud's entire dream theory was built on a misconception, that there was no hidden message to decode because there was no message in the first place. The content of dreams wasn't meaningful in Freud's sense. It was generated by a random process and shaped by the brain's automatic narrative tendencies. The emperor had no clothes, or rather, the dream had no latent content. The manifest content was all there was. Now, as you might imagine, this did not go over well with everyone. The psychoanalytic community was furious. Hobson was accused of being reductionist, of dismissing the richness of subjective experience, of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And to be fair, the activation synthesis hypothesis in its original form did have some real limitations. The idea that the brainstem signals were purely random turned out to be an oversimplification. Later research showed that REM sleep involves specific, structured patterns of brain activation. It's not just noise. Particular brain regions are consistently more active during REM, including the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the visual cortex, while others, notably the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain most associated with rational planning, logical reasoning, and self-awareness, are consistently less active. That's not random. That's a specific pattern, and it has implications for the kind of experiences REM sleep produces. Hobson himself revised the theory substantially over the years, eventually developing what he called the AIM model, a framework describing brain states in terms of activation level, input source, and mode of processing. The neurochemical shift during REM, decreased serotonin and norepinephrine, increased acetylcholine, helps explain why dreams have the qualities they do. Vivid imagery, because the visual cortex is highly active. Intense emotions, because the amygdala is firing. Bizarre logic, because the prefrontal cortex is offline. And that last point, the prefrontal cortex going quiet during REM, is actually one of the most important findings in modern dream research. Why don't you realize you're dreaming? In waking life, you have this constant background awareness of what makes sense and what doesn't. If someone told you that your deceased grandmother was in the kitchen making pancakes, you'd know something was wrong. But in a dream, you accept that completely. Your grandmother is there. The kitchen has 5 doors and opens onto a beach. Fine. No problem. The neuroimaging data shows us exactly why. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the brain region that does critical reasoning, is deactivated during REM sleep. You're hallucinating without a fact checker. So by the 1990s and 2000s, the neuroscience of dreaming had progressed enormously. We knew which brain regions were active during REM. We knew the neurochemical profile. We had sophisticated models of how the brainstem and forebrain interact to generate the dream state. But the big question, the why question, was still very much open, because knowing how dreams are generated doesn't tell you why the brain generates them. Is it just an accident, a byproduct of REM sleep that serves some other function? Or is dreaming itself doing something useful? And this is where the theories start to multiply, because there isn't just one answer. There are several compelling theories, each supported by evidence, each explaining some aspects of dreaming better than others. And the truth, as is so often the case in biology, is probably that dreams serve multiple functions, or that different aspects of dreaming serve different purposes. Let me walk you through the main contenders, because they're fascinating, and each one reveals something different about how the brain works. The first, and in some ways the most widely supported, is the memory consolidation theory. The idea here is that sleep, and particularly the interplay between NREM and REM sleep, plays a critical role in processing and consolidating memories, taking the experiences of the day, sorting through them, deciding what to keep and what to discard, and strengthening the neural connections that encode important information. The evidence for this is substantial and comes from multiple directions. If you learn a new task, a motor skill, a list of vocabulary words, a set of spatial relationships, and then sleep on it, you'll perform better afterward than if you'd stayed awake for the same amount of time. This has been replicated hundreds of times in laboratories around the world. And it's not just that rest helps. Sleep specifically helps, in a way that quiet wakefulness does not. Something is happening during sleep that actively strengthens newly formed memories. What's particularly interesting is that different types of sleep seem to handle different types of memory. Deep, slow-wave sleep, with its big, slow, synchronized brain waves, appears to be especially important for declarative memory, facts, events, explicit knowledge. The hippocampus, which is critical for forming new memories during the day, essentially replays the day's experiences during slow-wave sleep, reactivating the neural patterns that were active during learning, and gradually transferring the memory representations to the neocortex for long-term storage. Researchers have actually been able to detect this replay. Using brain imaging in both animals and humans, they've shown that the same patterns of neural activity that occurred during a learning experience are reactivated during subsequent sleep. It's as if the brain is rehearsing what happened, running through it again and again, etching it deeper. And REM sleep? REM seems to be especially important for emotional memory, for procedural memory, the kind of know-how that's embedded in skills, and for something more subtle and arguably more interesting, the integration of new memories with existing knowledge. There's evidence that during REM sleep, the brain doesn't just replay memories faithfully. It plays with them. It recombines elements, creates new associations, connects things that weren't connected before. Some researchers call this memory triage, the brain deciding what's important, what's related, how new information fits into what you already know. And this recombination, this creative shuffling, might be exactly what produces the bizarre and seemingly random content of dreams. Your dream isn't random noise, as Hobson initially suggested. It's your brain actively processing memories, but in a loose, associative, non-linear way that looks chaotic from the outside, while actually doing important cognitive work underneath. There's a lovely study by Robert Stickgold at Harvard that illustrates this beautifully. He had subjects play Tetris for several hours before sleep. Many dreamed about it, seeing the falling blocks, trying to fit them together. But here's the fascinating part. Some subjects were amnesiacs, people with severe hippocampal damage who couldn't form new conscious memories. They couldn't remember having played Tetris at all, but they still dreamed about it. The memory had been processed below conscious awareness, and it showed up in dreams anyway. Dreams, it seems, can access memories the conscious mind cannot. And this brings us to a second major theory, the threat simulation theory, proposed by the Finnish neuroscientist Antti Revonsuo in 2000. Revonsuo argues that dreaming evolved as a kind of virtual reality rehearsal for threatening situations. The brain simulates dangerous scenarios, being chased, falling, facing disasters, social conflicts, so that if you encounter similar situations in waking life, you've already practiced your response. The dream is a flight simulator for survival. The evidence is circumstantially compelling. Studies of dream content consistently find that negative emotions are far more common than positive ones. Dreams frequently involve being chased, attacked, falling, failing. We dream about threats far more often than pleasant experiences. Revonsuo argues this bias is not a flaw, it's a feature. The brain is selectively simulating scenarios that matter most for survival. Not all dreams are threatening, of course, but the general bias toward threats would be enough to be adaptive, and people who live in more dangerous environments tend to have more threat-related dreams, consistent with the idea that the dream system is calibrated by experience. But here's where it gets really interesting, because there's a third theory that takes the emotional dimension of dreaming in yet another direction. This one comes from Matthew Walker, the neuroscientist and author of Why We Sleep, and from a body of research suggesting that REM sleep serves a specific function in emotional regulation. The idea is that REM sleep acts as a kind of overnight therapy session. It processes the emotional experiences of the day, stripping away the raw emotional charge while preserving the memory of what happened. You go to bed upset about an argument. You dream about it, perhaps, and in the morning, the memory is still there, but it hurts less. The sharp edge has been taken off. Walker points to a specific neurochemical feature of REM sleep to explain this. During REM, norepinephrine, the brain's version of adrenaline, the neurotransmitter most associated with stress and anxiety, drops to almost zero. This is one of the few times in the 24-hour cycle when the brain is active but completely free of this stress chemical. Walker argues that this creates a unique neurochemical environment in which emotional memories can be reprocessed without the accompanying stress response. You're reliving the experience, in a sense, but in a safe chemical context. The emotional memory is being decoupled from the emotional reaction. It's being filed away with its informational content intact, but its emotional sting removed. And there's evidence that when this process goes wrong, the consequences can be severe. People with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, have abnormal REM sleep. Their norepinephrine levels don't drop properly during REM, and they experience recurring nightmares, the same traumatic memory replaying over and over without the emotional processing that would normally diffuse it. The nightmare is the same every time because the emotional recalibration isn't happening. The memory never gets processed. It stays raw. Walker argues that this is essentially a failure of the REM sleep emotional processing system, and it explains why sleep disturbances are such a consistent feature of PTSD. It's not just that trauma makes it hard to sleep, it's that disrupted sleep prevents the brain from processing the trauma. It's a vicious cycle. Makes sense, right? And yet, even this theory doesn't explain everything. It doesn't fully account for the bizarre narrative structure of dreams, the wild creativity, the shape-shifting logic. It explains the emotional dimension beautifully, but dreams are more than emotions. They're stories. Strange, disjointed, often absurd stories. Why stories? Why not just emotional processing without the hallucinated narrative? And that leads us to yet another theory, one that I find particularly intriguing because it connects dreaming to something we don't usually associate with sleep: creativity. There's a growing body of research suggesting that the loose, associative, uninhibited cognitive style of dreaming isn't just a byproduct of the brain's nocturnal chemistry. It's actually a feature that enhances creative problem-solving. Dreams allow the brain to make connections that it wouldn't make during waking life, when the prefrontal cortex is acting as a filter, enforcing logic and consistency. With that filter removed, remote associations emerge. Ideas that seemed unrelated get linked. Problems that seemed unsolvable get approached from entirely new angles. The history of science and art is full of famous examples. Auguste Kekulé, the 19th century chemist, reportedly dreamed of a snake biting its own tail and woke up with the insight that the benzene molecule has a ring structure. Elias Howe, the inventor of the sewing machine, was stuck on how to design the needle until he dreamed of being attacked by warriors carrying spears with holes in their tips. He realized the hole needed to be at the point of the needle, not the base. Paul McCartney has said that the melody for Yesterday came to him in a dream. Now, these anecdotes are famous precisely because they're unusual. Most dreams don't produce breakthrough inventions. But the underlying principle that the dreaming brain operates in a mode that's more conducive to novel associations is supported by experimental evidence. Stickgold and Walker, among others, have shown that after a period of REM sleep, people are better at solving anagram puzzles, better at seeing distant semantic associations, better at what psychologists call divergent thinking, the ability to generate multiple creative solutions to a problem. Non-REM sleep doesn't produce the same benefit. Something about the REM state specifically, with its peculiar combination of high cortical activation and suppressed prefrontal control, seems to foster a kind of cognitive flexibility that waking consciousness, for all its virtues, simply can't match. So we've got memory consolidation, threat simulation, emotional regulation, and creative problem-solving. 4 theories, each with evidence, each explaining something real about why we dream. And rather than fighting over which one is the right answer, most contemporary researchers are converging on the view that dreaming probably serves all of these functions to some degree, and possibly others we haven't fully identified yet. The brain is not a single-purpose machine. Sleep is not a single-purpose state. And dreaming, this extraordinarily complex neurological phenomenon that involves massive portions of the brain's architecture, is probably not doing just one thing. It's doing many things, in the same way that waking consciousness does many things. Perceiving, remembering, planning, feeling, all at once, woven together into a single experience. But there's one more piece of the dreaming puzzle that we haven't talked about yet, and it's one that sits right at the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, and some genuinely strange phenomenology. It's the phenomenon of lucid dreaming, the experience of knowing that you're dreaming while you're still inside the dream. And the story of how lucid dreaming went from being dismissed as impossible to being confirmed in the laboratory, and what it's taught us about the nature of consciousness itself, is one of the most surprising chapters in modern sleep science. Because for a long time, the idea that you could be aware you were dreaming, that you could maintain conscious self-reflection while inside a dream, seemed like a contradiction in terms. Being asleep means you're not aware. Being aware means you're not asleep. A lucid dream seemed as impossible as dry water. And yet, people had been reporting the experience for centuries. The earliest known written description that clearly describes lucid dreaming comes from Aristotle, yes, him again, who wrote in the 4th century BCE that sometimes when one is asleep, there is something in consciousness which declares that what then presents itself is but a dream. The 8th century Tibetan Buddhist text, The Yoga of the Dream State describes practices for maintaining awareness during dreaming as a form of spiritual development. Saint Augustine mentioned a lucid dream experienced by a physician named Gennadius in the 5th century. Thomas Reid, the Scottish philosopher, wrote about it in the 18th century. The French sinologist Marquis d'Hervé de Saint-Denis published a detailed account of his lucid dreaming experiences in 1867 in a book with the wonderful title Dreams and How to Guide Them. But despite these scattered reports spanning millennia, mainstream science largely ignored lucid dreaming for most of the 20th century. It was considered anecdotal, unreliable, probably just a borderline waking state that people were mistaking for sleep. How could you verify it? If someone tells you they were aware during a dream, how do you know they were actually asleep and actually dreaming, and not just in some light state of drowsiness where fragments of conscious thought were mingling with hypnagogic imagery? The answer came from a brilliantly simple experiment, and the person who designed it was a psychophysiologist at Stanford named Stephen LaBerge. LaBerge was himself a lucid dreamer. He'd been experiencing lucid dreams since childhood, and as a graduate student in the late 1970s, he became determined to find a way to prove their existence scientifically. And here was his insight. During REM sleep, your body is paralyzed. Remember REM atonia? Your voluntary muscles are suppressed. You can't move your arms, can't move your legs, can't speak. But your eyes are not paralyzed. In fact, your eyes are moving. That's literally what defines REM sleep: rapid eye movements. And here's the crucial connection. Eye movements during REM sleep correspond, at least partially, to where the dreamer is looking in the dream. If you dream about watching a tennis match, your eyes track back and forth. Studies had shown this correlation. So LaBerge's plan was simple and elegant. He would train himself to become lucid in a dream, to realize he was dreaming, and then, upon becoming lucid, he would make a prearranged signal with his eyes. Specifically, he would move his eyes in a distinctive pattern, left, right, a sequence that would stand out clearly on the electrooculogram recording being made in the laboratory. The rest of his body would be paralyzed, as expected during REM sleep, but his eyes could signal. He was essentially sending a message from inside the dream to the waking world. In 1978, LaBerge did it. He was sleeping in the Stanford Sleep Laboratory, wired up to an EEG and electrooculogram, monitored by observers. He fell asleep, entered REM sleep, confirmed by the EEG and the characteristic REM atonia, and then, at a specific moment during a confirmed REM period, the recording showed a clear, unmistakable left-right eye movement signal. When he was woken up immediately afterward, he reported that he had become aware he was dreaming, and had deliberately made the eye signal as agreed. The physiological data confirmed he was in REM sleep when it happened. He was asleep, he was dreaming, and he was aware. LaBerge published these findings in the early 1980s, and the results were independently replicated in England by Keith Hearne, who had actually made a similar breakthrough slightly earlier, in 1975, though his work was published less prominently. Together, these experiments settled the question. Lucid dreaming was real. It was not a waking state. It was not light sleep. It was genuine REM sleep dreaming, with a layer of self-awareness on top. And once lucid dreaming was established as a legitimate phenomenon, it became an incredibly valuable tool for studying the neuroscience of consciousness. Think about what it gives you. In an ordinary dream, the dreamer is a passive passenger. They experience the dream, but can't communicate with researchers about what's happening in real time. In a lucid dream, the dreamer can follow instructions. They can signal with their eyes. They can perform prearranged tasks within the dream. clench their fists, count to 10, sing a song, while researchers monitor their brain activity. This creates a situation that's almost impossible to achieve any other way. You have a person who is simultaneously in a dream state and in communication with the waking world. It's a bridge between subjective experience and objective measurement that's unique in all of neuroscience. Brain imaging studies of lucid dreaming, made possible by advances in neuroimaging technology, have revealed something fascinating. During ordinary, non-lucid REM sleep, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, remember, that's the rational, self-aware, logical part of the brain that goes quiet during normal dreaming, is deactivated. That's why you don't realize you're dreaming. But during lucid dreaming, parts of the prefrontal cortex reactivate. Not fully, it's not a waking level of activation, but enough to restore some degree of self-awareness and executive control while the rest of the dream state continues. You've essentially got a hybrid brain state. The emotional, visual, narrative-generating machinery of the dream is still running, but the monitor, the observer, the part of you that can step back and say, wait, this isn't real, that's come back online, at least partially. And this raises some genuinely deep questions about consciousness, because it suggests that self-awareness, that sense of I that we take for granted in waking life, is not a single thing that's either on or off. It's more like a dial. During deep sleep, it's at 0. During normal dreaming, it's at a low level. You have experiences, you have a point of view, but you lack reflective self-awareness. During lucid dreaming, the dial is turned up a notch. You have reflective awareness within the dream. And during normal waking, it's at its highest. What this means is that consciousness comes in degrees, and the dreaming brain occupies a genuinely interesting middle ground, conscious enough to hallucinate an entire world and populate it with characters and narrative, but not conscious enough, usually, to notice that the whole thing is a fabrication. Unless you're lucid, and then you're in this extraordinary position of observing your own consciousness, generating an imaginary world in real time, and knowing it. People who have experienced lucid dreams often describe it as one of the most remarkable experiences of their lives. The dream world, they say, looks and feels entirely real. The colors, the textures, the spatial depth, the emotional tone. But there's this additional layer of awareness that makes it feel like you're both the dreamer and the audience. Some people learn to control their lucid dreams, flying, teleporting, transforming objects, summoning people. Others prefer to simply observe, to explore the dream environment with the fascination of someone walking through a museum of their own unconscious mind. And here's something worth sitting with for a moment. The fact that your brain can generate a reality that's subjectively indistinguishable from the waking world, complete with physics, lighting, perspective, emotional weight, other people who seem autonomous, that's a profound demonstration of how much of your waking experience is actually a construction. You think you're perceiving the world directly, seeing it as it is, but you're not. You're constructing a model of the world based on sensory inputs, and your brain does this so seamlessly that the model feels like the thing itself. Dreaming proves this, because in a dream, the same constructive process happens without any external input at all. The brain generates the model entirely from within, and it's so convincing that you believe it completely. What that tells you is that your brain is always building reality from the inside. During waking life, it has sensory data to constrain the construction. During dreaming, the construction runs free, but the machinery is the same. Now, let's pivot from the experience of individual dreams to something broader, the question of whether everyone dreams the same way, and what the variations tell us about how the mind works. Because one of the most fascinating things about dream research is how much dreams vary across individuals, across cultures, and across the lifespan, and yet how much they also share in common. Let's start with the question most people wonder about. Do we all dream? The answer, as far as we can tell, is yes. Everyone with a normal brain and normal sleep cycles experiences REM sleep, and almost everyone who is woken during REM sleep reports dream experiences. There are some people who claim they never dream, and this is a genuinely interesting population for researchers to study. In most cases, it appears that these people do dream. Their REM sleep is normal, but they don't remember their dreams upon waking. Memory for dreams is fragile and depends on several factors, including whether you wake up during or shortly after a REM period, how much attention you pay to your dreams, and individual differences in certain brain structures. A 2014 study using brain imaging found that people who frequently recall their dreams tend to have higher resting state blood flow in the medial prefrontal cortex and the temporoparietal junction, brain areas involved in attention and self-referential processing. So, the difference between a dreamer and a non-dreamer may be less about whether dreams occur and more about whether the brain's attention and memory systems are engaged enough to capture them. But there is, it should be said, a rare neurological condition called Charcot-Wilbrand syndrome, in which damage to specific brain regions, particularly in the posterior cortex, areas involved in visual imagery and spatial processing, appears to actually eliminate dreaming. Patients with this condition not only don't remember dreams, they seem not to have them at all, even during REM sleep. This is significant because it tells us something about the neural machinery required for dream generation. It's not just REM sleep that produces dreams. You also need specific cortical regions, particularly the ones involved in generating visual spatial imagery. Damage those, and the dreaming machinery breaks. And this connects to important work by the South African neuropsychologist Mark Solms, whose studies of brain-damaged patients in the 1990s challenged some fundamental assumptions. Solms found that some lesions could eliminate dreaming while leaving REM sleep intact, and conversely, damage to the brainstem regions that generate REM didn't always eliminate dreaming. REM and dreaming, while strongly correlated, are not the same thing. Solms argued that dreams are generated not by the brainstem system that triggers REM, but by a dopaminergic forebrain circuit linked to seeking, wanting, and desire, the brain's reward system. If Solms is right, it changes the picture significantly. Dreaming is driven not by random activations, but by a motivational system, which, in a strange way, brings us back toward Freud. Freud said dreams are driven by wishes. Solms says they're driven by a brain system associated with wanting and seeking. The mechanisms are completely different. No censor, no disguise. But the core intuition that dreams are motivationally driven rather than randomly generated finds surprising support. After decades of arguing Freud was wrong about everything, here's modern neuroscience suggesting he may have been wrong about the specifics, but right about something deep and general. Now, let's shift to something a little different. The content of dreams, what people actually dream about, and what the patterns tell us. Because there have been extensive, systematic studies of dream content, going back decades, and the findings are surprisingly consistent. The most comprehensive study of dream content was conducted by Calvin Hall, who collected over 50,000 dream reports across decades. His findings remain among the most cited in dream research. Dreams overwhelmingly take place in familiar settings. Characters are usually people you know. Negative emotions are more frequent than positive ones. Aggressive interactions are more common than friendly ones. And certain themes are remarkably universal: being chased, falling, being naked in public, arriving late or unprepared, losing teeth, flying. These appear across cultures and historical periods, probably reflecting common human anxieties rather than culturally specific ones. At the same time, dreams clearly reflect personal experience. If you're studying for an exam, you dream about exams. If you've just gone through a breakup, you dream about your ex. This is the continuity hypothesis. Dreams are continuous, with waking concerns, reflecting and processing what's on your mind. Not in the disguised, symbolic way Freud proposed, but in a fairly straightforward way that makes intuitive sense. And children's dreams are particularly telling. Very young children, under about age 5, tend to have dreams that are relatively simple and static. They might dream about an animal, or about eating, or about being in a familiar place, but the dreams lack the complex narrative structure and self-representation that characterize adult dreams. The dreaming child often isn't even present as a character in their own dream. By age 7 or 8, dreams become more complex, more narrative, more emotional, and the child begins to appear as an active protagonist. This developmental trajectory parallels the maturation of the brain, particularly the prefrontal and parietal cortices involved in self-representation and narrative cognition. Dreaming, it seems, is not a fixed capacity that you're born with. It develops as the brain develops. The machinery for generating complex, immersive, self-referential dream experiences takes years to fully come online. And then there are nightmares, the dark side of dreaming, the dreams that wake you up with your heart racing, drenched in sweat, sometimes afraid to go back to sleep. And nightmares are interesting for several reasons, not least because they raise a direct challenge to any theory that says dreaming is purely beneficial. If dreams serve an adaptive function, processing memories, simulating threats, regulating emotions, then why do some dreams go so terrifyingly wrong? Why does the system sometimes produce experiences that are not just unpleasant, but genuinely traumatic? The answer may be that nightmares are what happens when the system is overwhelmed. Under normal conditions, the emotional processing function of REM sleep works smoothly. It takes the day's experiences, strips away the excess emotional charge, files the memories appropriately. But when the emotional material is too intense, too traumatic, too much for the system to handle in a single pass, the processing breaks down. Instead of diffusing the emotional charge, the dream amplifies it. Instead of integrating the memory, the dream replays it in raw, unprocessed form. And that's what a nightmare is, a failure of the brain's nocturnal emotional processing, a memory that's too hot for the system to cool down. This framework helps explain why nightmares are more common during periods of stress, anxiety, and trauma. It explains why children have more nightmares than adults. Their emotional regulation systems are less mature, less able to handle the intensity. And it explains the particular horror of PTSD nightmares, which often replay the traumatic event with terrifying fidelity, sometimes for years. The REM sleep system keeps trying to process the trauma, and it keeps failing, stuck in a loop of reactivation without resolution. There's another fascinating dimension to nightmares that connects to the broader neuroscience of dreaming, and it has to do with that boundary between sleep and waking, the transitions that happen as you fall asleep and as you wake up. Because some of the most terrifying sleep experiences people have aren't dreams at all, in the traditional sense. They're episodes of sleep paralysis, and they occupy a strange territory between sleeping and waking that our ancestors would have recognized immediately, because people have been describing these experiences with remarkable consistency across every culture and every century we have records for. And the descriptions are always terrifying. Here's what happens. You wake up, or at least, you think you wake up. You're lying in bed. You can see your room. You can hear ambient sounds. You know where you are. But you can't move. Your body is completely paralyzed. You try to lift your arm, and nothing happens. You try to turn your head, and it won't respond. You try to call out, and your voice is frozen. And then, very often, there's something else in the room with you. A presence, a figure, something dark, heavy, malevolent, pressing on your chest, crouching at the edge of your bed, standing in the doorway. You feel pure, unfiltered terror, not the narrative fear of a nightmare, where things are happening to a dream you in a dream world, but fear in your real body, in your real bedroom, while you're apparently awake and yet completely unable to respond. Sleep paralysis. And once you understand the neuroscience of REM sleep, it makes perfect sense, even if the experience itself is anything but sensible. Remember, during REM sleep, two things happen simultaneously. The brain becomes highly active, generating vivid internal experiences, and the body becomes paralyzed through REM atonia, as the brainstem suppresses voluntary muscle activity. Normally, these two things switch on and off together. You enter REM, you get the paralysis and the dreams. You leave REM, the paralysis lifts and the dreams stop. But sometimes, the transition goes wrong. You wake up, your consciousness returns. You become aware of your real environment, but the REM atonia hasn't released yet. Your body is still locked in the paralysis of REM sleep, and because parts of the dreaming brain are still active, the vivid, hallucinatory imagery of the dream state bleeds into your waking perception. You see your bedroom, but overlaid on top of it are dream-generated hallucinations. The dark figure, the sense of presence, the crushing weight on your chest. And this is almost certainly the origin of a vast number of supernatural beliefs throughout human history. The incubus and succubus of medieval folklore, the kanashibari of Japanese tradition, the old hag of Newfoundland, jinn attacks in Middle Eastern cultures, all describe the same experience: waking paralysis, a sense of presence, chest pressure, terror. The descriptions are remarkably consistent because the underlying neurology is the same. The cultural interpretation varies: demon, ghost, witch, alien, but the experience is universal because the brain is universal. Some researchers have argued that sleep paralysis also accounts for many reported alien abduction experiences. The psychologist Susan Clancy found that people reporting abductions were significantly more likely to have experienced sleep paralysis than the general population. In the Middle Ages, the framework was demons. In the modern era, it's aliens. The neurology is identical. Sleep paralysis affects somewhere between 8 and 50% of people at some point in their lives. It's more common in adolescents, people who sleep on their backs, and those with disrupted sleep schedules. Episodes usually last only seconds to minutes. They're profoundly unpleasant, but not dangerous. The paralysis always resolves. Now, let's pull back from these dramatic experiences and return to something more fundamental: the question of what's happening in the brain at a deeper level during dreaming, beyond the broad strokes of REM is active and the prefrontal cortex is offline. Because modern neuroscience has given us tools, fMRI, PET scans, high-density EEG, optogenetics in animal models, that are allowing researchers to peer into the dreaming brain with unprecedented precision. And what they're finding is complicated, fascinating, and sometimes genuinely surprising. One of the most important advances has been the ability to decode dream content from brain activity. This sounds like science fiction, and to be clear, we're not at the point where a machine can read your dreams like a movie. But researchers have made real progress toward predicting what a person is dreaming about based on their brain activity during sleep. A landmark study was published in 2013 by a team at the ATR Computational Neuroscience Laboratories in Kyoto, Japan, led by Tomoyasu Horikawa and Yukiyasu Kamitani. Here's what they did. They trained a machine learning algorithm on the relationship between visual brain activity and visual perception. They showed subjects thousands of images while scanning their brains with fMRI, building a map of which patterns of brain activity corresponded to which types of visual content. Then they let the subjects fall asleep in the scanner, monitored their brain activity during the initial period of sleep onset, hypnagogic imagery, the fragmented hallucinations that occur as you drift off, and woke them up to ask what they'd been seeing. And they found that the decoder, trained on waking visual activity, could predict the general category of dream content with significantly better than chance accuracy. If the brain activity pattern during sleep resembled the pattern associated with seeing buildings during wakefulness, the person was likely to report dreaming about buildings. This doesn't mean we can read dreams. The predictions were broad categories: building, person, animal, not specific images. But the principle is profound. It means that the brain activity patterns underlying visual perception are similar whether the stimulus is coming from the outside world or from the dreaming mind. The same neural machinery that represents a tree when you see an actual tree is activated when you dream about a tree. Your brain doesn't have a separate system for generating dream imagery. It uses the same representational toolkit, just driven by internal signals instead of external ones. And this connects to the default mode network, a set of brain regions most active when you're not focused on the outside world, when you're daydreaming, mind-wandering, imagining the future, remembering the past. The default mode network is highly active during REM sleep. Dreaming may be what happens when this network runs without the constraints of sensory input and executive control. Some researchers suggest dreaming and waking mind-wandering are fundamentally the same process, the brain's spontaneous generation of internal narratives, just modulated by the sleep-wake state. And this idea connects to a broader theory about consciousness itself, that it is, at its core, a narrative process, the brain's ongoing construction of a story about who you are and what's happening. During waking life, the story is constrained by sensory input. During dreaming, the constraints are lifted, and the story becomes freer, stranger, more emotionally charged. But it never stops. The brain is always narrating, always constructing, always dreaming, in a sense, even when you're awake. Now, here's where I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, because it becomes more interesting the deeper you go. We talked about how different types of sleep seem to serve different functions for memory: slow-wave sleep for declarative memory, REM for emotional memory and creative association. But recent research has suggested that the interplay between NREM and REM sleep within a single cycle may be just as important as either stage alone. Think of it this way. During slow-wave sleep, the hippocampus replays the day's experiences, faithfully, accurately, like running a recording. This replay transfers information to the neocortex for longer-term storage. But then, during the subsequent REM period, the neocortex does something different with that information. It integrates it. It connects it to existing knowledge. It recombines it in novel ways. The NREM replay provides the raw material. The REM processing does the creative synthesis. And the 90-minute sleep cycle, with its alternation of NREM and REM, ensures that this two-step process happens repeatedly throughout the night, each cycle working on different material. Some researchers describe this as a dialogue between two memory systems, the hippocampus, which is a fast learner but has limited capacity, and the neocortex, which learns slowly but can store vast amounts of information indefinitely. During the day, the hippocampus rapidly absorbs new experiences. During sleep, it transfers those experiences to the neocortex through a carefully orchestrated process of replay and integration. And dreams might be, at least in part, the subjective experience of that process, not a random byproduct, not a meaningless hallucination, but the felt quality of your brain reorganizing itself, updating its model of the world, filing away what matters and discarding what doesn't. There's a beautiful experiment that illustrates this. Researchers at the University of Chicago trained rats to navigate a maze, recording the firing patterns of place cells in the hippocampus as the rats ran through the corridors. Place cells are neurons that fire when an animal is in a specific location. Each cell has its place field, and as the rat moves through the maze, the cells fire in a characteristic sequence. And when the researchers recorded hippocampal activity during subsequent sleep, they found the same cells firing in the same sequence. The rats were replaying the maze in their sleep, running it again in their minds, and the replays happened during slow-wave sleep sharp-wave ripples at a compressed timescale, faster than real time, as if the brain were speedrunning through the experience to extract and consolidate the important information. Were the rats dreaming about the maze? We can't ask them, obviously, but the neural evidence strongly suggests that something like dreaming was occurring, an internal simulation of a waking experience, driven by the same neural circuits, happening during sleep. And if rats do it, and humans do it, and the same hippocampal replay mechanisms have been found in both, then whatever function this process serves is probably deeply conserved in mammalian evolution. It's not a luxury, it's not a quirk, it's something the brain does because it needs to. And this brings us to a question that feels both scientific and philosophical. Do animals dream? The answer, based on everything we know about comparative neuroscience, is almost certainly yes, at least for mammals and birds. All mammals studied so far exhibit REM sleep. Dogs clearly dream. You've probably watched a sleeping dog twitch its paws, whimper, move its eyes behind closed lids. Cats dream. The evidence there is particularly compelling because of a famous experiment by the French neuroscientist Michel Jouvet in the 1960s. Jouvet lesioned a small area of the brainstem in cats, the area responsible for REM atonia, the muscle paralysis of REM sleep. And what happened was extraordinary. The cats would enter REM sleep, and instead of lying still, they would get up and act out their dreams. They would stalk invisible prey, pounce on nothing, arch their backs as if facing a threat, all while their EEG showed they were unmistakably in REM sleep. Their eyes were unfocused. They didn't respond to real objects in the room. They were clearly interacting with an internally generated world. It was the first direct evidence that animals have the immersive, hallucinatory experience we call dreaming, not just the physiological state. Birds have REM sleep too. Zebra finches replay the neural patterns of song learning during sleep. The same neurons active when a young finch practices its song reactivate during sleep. The finch is rehearsing its song in its dreams. Reptiles are less clear. A 2016 study of bearded dragons found two distinct sleep states resembling slow-wave sleep and REM, but whether reptiles dream experientially remains unknown. Here's what's fascinating about the comparative picture. REM sleep appeared early in mammalian evolution and has been conserved across an enormous range of species. Even dolphins, which sleep one hemisphere at a time, show REM-like states. The fact that evolution has maintained this metabolically expensive, potentially dangerous state across hundreds of millions of years, suggests it serves a function important enough to justify the costs. Whatever dreaming does, it's not optional. And speaking of paying for itself, let's talk about what happens when you don't get enough of it. Because one of the most powerful arguments for the importance of dreaming comes not from studying dreams directly, but from studying what happens when people are deprived of sleep, and particularly REM sleep. We already mentioned Dement's early REM deprivation studies, where subjects showed increasingly desperate attempts to enter REM and exhibited irritability and difficulty concentrating. But the evidence has gotten much more detailed since then, and it paints a sobering picture. Sleep deprivation, particularly REM sleep deprivation, impairs emotional regulation, worsens mood, increases anxiety and irritability, disrupts memory consolidation, reduces creative problem-solving ability, and, over extended periods, can produce genuinely psychiatric symptoms, paranoia, hallucinations, delusions. And these effects are not just laboratory curiosities. They play out in the real world in ways that have enormous consequences. Matthew Walker has been one of the most vocal scientists, arguing that we're in the midst of a sleep deprivation epidemic, with research linking insufficient sleep to cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, impaired immune function, Alzheimer's disease, depression, and reduced life expectancy. Many of these involve precisely the functions REM sleep appears to serve. One finding is particularly striking. Walker and colleagues showed that a single night of sleep deprivation increases amygdala reactivity by about 60%, while reducing its connectivity to the prefrontal cortex. The result is a brain that's more emotionally reactive and less able to control those reactions, and this effect is specifically associated with loss of REM sleep, concentrated in the later part of the night, exactly the sleep that gets cut short when you set an early alarm. Every time you sacrifice those last couple of hours, you're selectively depriving yourself of the emotional processing your brain needs. Your emotional thermostat is miscalibrated the next day, not because you're weak, but because your brain didn't finish its housekeeping. And this connects to a broader point about the relationship between sleep and mental health that has become increasingly clear in recent years. For a long time, sleep disturbances were considered a symptom of mental illness. Depression causes insomnia, anxiety causes disrupted sleep, and so on. But the emerging picture is that the relationship runs both ways, and the causal arrow from sleep disruption to mental health problems may be at least as strong as the one running the other direction. Poor sleep doesn't just accompany depression. It may contribute to causing it by preventing the emotional processing that healthy REM sleep provides. Treating sleep problems often improves mental health symptoms, sometimes substantially, and the dreaming function of sleep, the emotional recalibration, the creative problem-solving, the memory consolidation, may be a more important factor in mental health than anyone realized until fairly recently. Which brings us, inevitably, to the edge of what we know and the questions that remain open. Because despite everything we've covered, the neuroscience, the theories, the experiments, the evolutionary perspective, the deepest mystery of dreaming is still, in some sense, untouched. We know a lot about the how of dreaming. We know which brain regions are active, which neurotransmitters are involved, what physiological markers accompany the dream state. We have good theories about the why: memory consolidation, emotional regulation, threat simulation, creativity. But the hard problem, the really hard problem, remains. Why is there something it's like to dream? Why does the brain generate subjective experience during sleep at all? Why not just do the memory consolidation and emotional processing silently, in the dark, without the elaborate theater of a dream? Why the vivid, immersive, felt quality? Why the story? And the honest answer is, we don't know. This is the hard problem of consciousness wearing its nighttime costume. We don't fully understand why there's subjective experience during waking life, either. So it's not surprising that we can't explain it during sleep. But dreaming does offer some unique clues, because it strips away the usual confounds. During waking consciousness, subjective experience is tangled up with sensory input, motor output, attention, and executive control. During dreaming, most of those are removed or radically altered, and yet consciousness persists. Something is still happening, that it's like something to undergo. That tells us that consciousness, whatever it is not dependent on external input or behavioral engagement. It's generated internally, by the brain, and it persists even when the external world goes away. Some neuroscientists argue this supports the idea that consciousness is fundamentally a prediction machine. The brain constantly generates predictions about what's happening, and sensory input serves mainly to correct those predictions. During dreaming, the prediction machinery runs without correction. The result is a free-running hallucination, consciousness unanchored by the world. That's a deep thought. Let's bring it back to something closer to the ground. The relationship between dreams and the body, the sensations that bleed into dreams, and the ways dreams can sometimes reach back out and affect the body in return. Because the boundary between the dreaming mind and the sleeping body is more porous than most people realize, and some of the most fascinating findings in dream research come from studying how they influence each other. Start with the direction you'd expect, the body influencing the dream. This is something Aristotle noticed over 2,000 years ago, and modern research has confirmed it repeatedly. External stimuli during sleep can be incorporated into dream content. If someone sprays water on your face while you're in REM sleep, you might dream about rain or standing under a waterfall. If an alarm clock goes off, you might dream that a phone is ringing or a fire alarm is sounding. If your bladder is full, you might, and you know this from personal experience, dream about desperately searching for a bathroom. The dreaming brain doesn't process these stimuli the way the waking brain does, with accurate source attribution and appropriate response. Instead, it weaves them into the ongoing dream narrative, reinterpreting them to fit the story. The spray of water doesn't wake you up and make you think, "Someone sprayed water on my face." It becomes rain, because the dreaming brain is in narrative mode and everything gets narrativized. Researchers have played sounds to sleeping subjects during REM and found that external stimuli are incorporated into dreams more often than chance predicts, but almost always transformed. A bell becomes a church bell in a dream about a wedding. A person's name spoken aloud might cause that person to appear as a dream character. The brain isn't simply registering the stimulus, it's translating it into dream language. There's also evidence that the body's internal state influences dreams. People with chronic pain dream about pain. People who are ill sometimes dream about illness. The sleeping brain monitors your body continuously. Temperature, position, organ function, immune activity, and it would be surprising if none of that made it into dreams. Now let's look at the other direction, the dream affecting the body. And here things get genuinely strange. During REM sleep, despite the general paralysis of voluntary muscles, the body responds physiologically to the content of the dream. Sexual dreams produce measurable genital arousal, penile erections in men, clitoral engorgement and vaginal lubrication in women. Frightening dreams accelerate heart rate and breathing. Dreams involving physical exertion can increase respiration even though the muscles aren't actually moving. The autonomic nervous system, the part that controls heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, and other involuntary functions, is not paralyzed during REM the way the voluntary muscles are. It responds to the emotional and physical content of the dream, as if the dream events were really happening. This is actually one of the things that makes nightmares genuinely unpleasant in a physiological sense, not just a psychological one. When you have a nightmare about being chased, your heart really does race. Your breathing really does get shallow and rapid. Stress hormones really do get released. Your body is having a partial stress response to an imaginary threat, and in people with certain cardiovascular conditions, severe nightmares can actually be dangerous. There are documented cases of cardiac events triggered by the physiological arousal of a nightmare. It's rare, but it underscores the point that dreams are not just mental events. They have real physical consequences. And then there's something even more curious: the phenomenon of dreaming about movement and its relationship to actual motor systems. We said that during REM sleep, the motor cortex is active. It's generating movement commands, but the brainstem suppresses those commands before they reach the muscles. You dream about running, and your motor cortex sends signals that would make your legs move, but those signals are intercepted. Your legs stay still. But the motor cortex activation is real. And here's what's fascinating. Practicing a motor skill in a lucid dream, where you can deliberately repeat movements with awareness, has been shown to actually improve physical performance after waking, not as much as physical practice, but measurably more than no practice at all. This was demonstrated in a study by Daniel Erlacher and Michael Schredel at the University of Heidelberg. They had subjects practice a specific motor task, tossing coins into a cup, in lucid dreams. The subjects would become lucid, perform the prearranged task in the dream, signal with their eyes, and continue practicing. When tested after waking, the lucid dream practice group showed improvement comparable to a group that had done mental rehearsal while awake, and significantly better than a group that did no practice. The dreaming brain, it seems, can serve as a genuine training ground for motor skills. The practice isn't physical. Your muscles don't move. But the neural circuits that plan and coordinate movement are being exercised, and that exercise transfers to waking performance. And this has practical implications that go beyond laboratory curiosities. Athletes have reported using lucid dreaming to visualize and rehearse their performances. Surgeons have described mentally practicing procedures in their sleep, and there's growing interest in whether dream-based rehearsal could be used therapeutically for people recovering from stroke or other conditions that impair motor function. If the motor cortex is active during dreaming, and if that activity can improve real-world performance, then harnessing the dream state for motor rehabilitation is at least theoretically possible. We're not there yet, but the principle is sound. Now, let me circle back to the chemistry of dreaming, because the neurochemical environment during REM is genuinely unusual and explains so much. During REM, serotonin and norepinephrine drop to near zero. Acetylcholine surges to levels as high as waking. Dopamine in the motivation circuits remains active. This profile maps remarkably onto the dream experience. No norepinephrine means no focused attention. The mind wanders freely. No serotonin means emotional volatility. High acetylcholine drives vivid sensory imagery. Active dopamine explains why dreams involve pursuit, desire, and narrative momentum. And here's the elegant part. Norepinephrine, the one conspicuously absent neurotransmitter, is the one most associated with reality testing. When it's flowing normally, you can evaluate experiences, check them against what you know, notice when something doesn't make sense. When it drops during REM, that checking function vanishes. You accept the dream uncritically, because the chemical that would enable you to question it isn't there. The bizarreness of dreams isn't just unusual imagery, it's chemistry. Your reality-testing neurotransmitter has gone to sleep. And this brings us to something practical, something that connects all this brain science to the experience you're having right now, or about to have, as you lie there and your mind starts to loosen its grip on the waking world. Because understanding the science of dreams doesn't strip them of their power. If anything, it deepens them. Knowing that your brain is about to embark on a complex, multi-stage process of memory consolidation, emotional calibration, and creative synthesis. Knowing that it will generate an entire virtual world to do this work, a world so convincing that you'll believe it completely. That's not disenchanting. That's astonishing. Your brain is about to do something that no computer can do. It's going to hallucinate, on purpose, for your benefit. Let's talk about one more thing before we start to wind down, because it's something that ties together several threads we've been following. We've talked about why we dream, what dreams are for, how they're generated, what they contain. But there's a question we haven't directly addressed, and it's one that people have wondered about for as long as they've been wondering about dreams at all. Do dreams mean anything? Not in the Freudian sense of hidden symbols and disguised wishes, but in a more straightforward sense. Do dreams contain genuine insights about our lives, our relationships, our problems? Can you learn something from a dream that you couldn't learn while awake? And the answer, based on current understanding, is probably, sometimes, in a specific way. Not because dreams are prophetic or because they tap into some mystical source of knowledge, but because the dreaming brain operates in a mode that's genuinely different from waking cognition, more associative, more emotionally attuned, less constrained by logic and convention. And that different mode of processing can sometimes surface insights, connections, and perspectives that the waking mind, with its filters and its habits and its rational blinders, misses. Think about it this way. During the day, your prefrontal cortex is the boss. It's directing attention, suppressing irrelevant information, enforcing logical consistency. That's mostly good. It's what allows you to function, to plan, to get things done. But it also means that certain thoughts, certain connections, certain emotional truths get suppressed. Not because they're forbidden, in the Freudian sense, but because they're not immediately relevant, or because they're uncomfortable, or because they don't fit the narrative the executive brain is maintaining. During dreaming, the boss goes home, the prefrontal cortex quiets down, and some of those suppressed connections, those inconvenient truths, those emotional undercurrents, can bubble up to the surface. You dream about a friend you've been neglecting, and wake up with a sudden clarity about how much they matter to you. You dream about a decision you've been avoiding, and wake up knowing what you want to do. You dream about a problem at work, and wake up with an approach you hadn't considered. These aren't magical. They're the natural result of a brain that's processing your life in a more emotionally honest, more associatively free mode than it does during the day. The dream doesn't have access to information you don't have, but it can organize and present information in ways that your waking mind doesn't. And this is probably the healthiest way to think about dream meaning, not as coded messages from the unconscious that need to be decoded by an expert, but as a different perspective on your own life, generated by your own brain, operating in a different mode. You don't need a dream dictionary. You don't need a psychoanalyst. You just need to pay attention to what your dreams are telling you, in the same way you'd pay attention to a feeling or an intuition, not as gospel truth, but as useful information, another data point about what's going on inside you. Some therapists use dreams this way, not interpreting them according to a fixed symbolic system, but using them as a starting point for conversation. What were you feeling in the dream? What does that remind you of? What situation in your life produces that same feeling? This approach treats the dream not as a message to be decoded, but as a mirror to be reflected on. And for many people, that's genuinely helpful. Not because the dream has a hidden meaning, but because attending to it forces you to pay attention to emotional material you might otherwise ignore. And now, as we approach the end of this long, wandering conversation about dreams, I want to come back to something we mentioned early on, something that brings the whole story full circle. We started by noting that after thousands of years of wondering and decades of rigorous science, we still don't have a complete, consensus answer to the question of why we dream. And I want to sit with that for a moment, because it's actually one of the most interesting things about the whole field. Here is one of the most universal human experiences, something that happens to virtually every person, every night, across every culture, throughout the entire history of the species, and we can't fully explain it. We understand the mechanism better than ever before. We know which brain regions are active, which chemicals are flowing, which stages of sleep are involved. We have compelling theories about the function, but the complete picture remains elusive, and there's something beautiful about that, honestly. In an age when it sometimes feels like science has explained everything, when the mystery has been drained from so much of the world, here is this thing that happens inside your own head every single night. This rich, strange, deeply personal experience, and it's still partly a mystery. Not because we haven't tried to understand it, but because it touches on some of the deepest questions in all of neuroscience. Questions about consciousness, about memory, about the nature of subjective experience, about what the brain is really doing when it generates a world from scratch and then lives inside it. These are not small questions. These are some of the hardest questions in science, and the fact that they converge right here, in the humble, everyday act of falling asleep and having a dream, tells you something about how much is going on beneath the surface of your ordinary life. Let me gather up some of the threads we've been following tonight, because they weave together into something genuinely remarkable when you see them as a whole. We started with the ancient world, with the Mesopotamians and Egyptians and Greeks, all of them struggling to make sense of these nightly visitations. For most of human history, the dominant framework was supernatural. Dreams came from the gods, from spirits, from the future, from some source outside the dreaming mind. And you can understand why. Dreams feel like they come from somewhere else. They arrive uninvited. They show you things you didn't expect. They carry an emotional weight that seems disproportionate to their content. The simplest explanation was that something was sending them to you. Then came the scientific revolution, slowly, unevenly, over centuries. Aristotle planted the seed of a naturalistic explanation, but it wasn't until the 19th century, with the development of neuroscience and the understanding of the brain as a physical organ, that the scientific study of dreams became even theoretically possible. And even then, the first grand theory, Freud's, was, despite its brilliance, ultimately more literary than scientific. Freud told a beautiful story about dreams, but it was a story built on interpretation rather than measurement, on clinical intuition rather than experimental evidence, on a model of the mind that was eloquent but unfalsifiable. The real breakthrough was technological. Berger's EEG gave us a way to watch the sleeping brain from outside. And then Aserinsky and Kleitman's discovery of REM sleep in 1953 gave us the crucial link between the biology of sleep and the psychology of dreams. Suddenly, dreaming had a physiological address. You could find it on a chart. You could predict when it would happen. You could design experiments around it. And from that single discovery flowed everything else. The mapping of sleep architecture, the REM deprivation studies, the brain imaging of dream states, the neurochemical profiling, the theories of memory consolidation and emotional regulation, and threat simulation and creative problem solving. And what the science has revealed is, in many ways, more fascinating than the myths it replaced. The ancient Greeks imagined that dreams were messages from the gods. What we've discovered is something arguably more extraordinary, that dreams are messages from your own brain, generated by the most complex object in the known universe, using mechanisms we're only beginning to understand. Every night, your brain runs a kind of overnight maintenance protocol, processing the day's experiences, consolidating memories, diffusing emotional charges, testing associations, building and revising its model of the world. And the dream is the experiential surface of that process, the part you can feel, the part that tells stories, the part that makes you fly and fall and find yourself inexplicably back in high school. And the deeper you look at it, the more you realize how much dreaming tells us about the nature of consciousness itself. Consider what the brain is doing during a dream. It's generating a complete virtual reality. Visual scenes, auditory experiences, spatial environments, characters with apparent agency, narratives with emotional arcs, all without any input from the outside world. The same perceptual machinery that processes light from your eyes and sound from your ears is being driven from within, producing experiences that are, from the inside, indistinguishable from reality. This means that the brain doesn't need the world to create experience. It can do it all on its own. And that, in turn, means that your waking experience of the world is not as different from dreaming as you might think. In both cases, the brain is constructing a model. During waking, the model is constrained by sensory data. During dreaming, it runs free. But the constructive process, the brain building reality from the inside, is the same. There's a philosopher named Evan Thompson who has written beautifully about this connection between dreaming, waking, and consciousness. He points out that dreaming challenges the assumption, deeply embedded in Western philosophy and common sense, that consciousness is primarily about representing an external world. Dreams show that consciousness is fundamentally generative. It creates experience, rather than just mirroring reality. And if that's true, then understanding dreaming might be crucial for understanding consciousness itself. The dream might not be a degraded or confused version of waking consciousness. It might be consciousness in its purest form, the creative, world-building, story-generating capacity of the mind, operating without external constraints. Think about what that means for you, lying there right now, feeling the heaviness start to settle into your limbs, your thoughts beginning to fragment and drift. The transition you're approaching, from waking to sleep, from the external world to the internal one, is not a diminishment. It's a transformation. Your brain is about to shift modes. The sensory gates are closing. The external world is fading. And something else is waking up inside you, a different kind of awareness, a different kind of experience, one that's been with our species since before we were a species, since before we could talk about it, since before we could wonder what it meant. And here's maybe the most comforting thought of all, when it comes to the science of dreams. All those theories we discussed, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, threat simulation, creative synthesis, they all point to the same basic conclusion. Your brain dreams because it cares about you. That sounds anthropomorphic, and maybe it is, but the underlying reality is real. But the dreaming brain is working for you. It's processing your experiences so you can learn from them. It's diffusing your emotional distress so you can face the next day with a clearer head. It's testing your responses to threats so you can react better if they come. It's making unexpected connections between ideas so you can solve problems you couldn't solve while awake. It's doing all of this automatically, without being asked, while you lie there doing nothing at all. You don't have to understand your dreams for them to do their work. The memory consolidation happens whether you remember the dream or not. The emotional regulation operates below the level of conscious awareness. The creative associations form in the background, ready to surface as an intuition or an insight the next day. Dreams are not homework you need to turn in. They're not tests you need to pass. They're your brain taking care of business. The nightly maintenance run of the most sophisticated information processing system in existence. And the variety of what happens during a night of dreaming is genuinely staggering when you think about it. In a single night, your brain will cycle through 4 to 6 complete sleep cycles, each about 90 minutes long. Early in the night, the cycles will be dominated by deep, slow-wave sleep, the stage associated with physical restoration and declarative memory consolidation. Your hippocampus will be replaying the day's events, transferring new memories to long-term storage, strengthening the neural pathways that encode what you learned. During these early cycles, your dreams, if you have them, will tend to be shorter, more thought-like, less vivid, more like fragments of recollection than immersive narratives. But as the night progresses, the balance shifts, the slow-wave sleep diminishes, and the REM periods grow longer and more intense. Your dreams become more elaborate, more emotionally charged, more narratively complex. The amygdala is more active. The visual cortex is generating richer imagery. The default mode network is humming. And the final REM period, the one that comes in the hour or two before your morning alarm, can last 30 or 40 minutes, long enough for a dream to develop a complex plot, introduce multiple characters, take you on a journey through multiple settings, and evoke emotions that stay with you after you wake. And throughout all of this, the two types of sleep are working together. The slow-wave sleep provides the raw material, the faithfully replayed memories, the factual content. The REM sleep processes that material, integrating it with existing knowledge, stripping away the emotional excess, finding the connections and patterns. It's a two-stroke engine. Replay and integrate. Consolidate and synthesize, and the whole thing cycles, over and over, through the night, each pass working on different material, each pass refining your brain's model of the world a little further. By the time you wake up, your brain has done more computational work than you could accomplish in a week of conscious effort. It's reorganized your memories, updated your emotional baselines, rehearsed your responses to potential threats, and generated novel associations between ideas. All of it happened while you were lying there, breathing slowly, eyes closed, muscles slack, to all appearances doing absolutely nothing. Sleep isn't nothing, it's everything. And dreaming is the part of that everything that briefly, tantalizingly, surfaces into awareness. A glimpse of the vast, tireless, endlessly creative machinery that's running just below the level of your conscious mind. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing about dreams. Not that they're strange, but that they're ordinary. Not that they happen once in a while, but that they happen every single night, to every person who sleeps normally, without exception. Dreaming is not a special state. It's a fundamental state. It's as basic to your biology as breathing or digesting. You will spend roughly 6 years of your life in REM sleep, dreaming. 6 years. That's not a trivial amount of time. That's not a minor side feature of being alive. That's a substantial portion of your existence, spent in an altered state of consciousness, experiencing internally generated realities, processing the material of your life in ways that you'll mostly never be aware of. And right now, as you lie there, and the edges of the world start to soften, as the thoughts begin to lose their edges and drift into something more fluid, less controlled, less insistent on making sense. Right now, you're at the threshold. The hypnagogic state, the borderland between waking and sleep, where consciousness starts to fragment and the first faint images begin to appear, unbidden, from somewhere inside you. A face you half recognize, a color that doesn't have a name, a sound that seems to come from far away or from very close by. You can't tell. These aren't dreams yet. They're the previews, the warm-up act. Your brain is shifting modes, dimming the external world, turning up the internal one. In a little while, the transition will complete, and you'll cross over fully into sleep, and the dreaming will begin. And when it does, when the first REM period arrives, maybe 60 or 70 minutes from now, your brain will do what it's done every night of your life since before you were born. Because fetuses dream, they spend the majority of their time in REM sleep, particularly in the third trimester. A fetus at 30 weeks of gestation spends about 24 hours a day in sleep, and most of that is REM. They haven't seen anything yet. They haven't experienced the world. But their brains are building the neural architecture that will make experience possible, forming connections, calibrating circuits, preparing the machinery of perception and emotion for the world they're about to enter. Dreaming may begin not as processing of experience, but as the brain's way of building itself. The first dreams are not about anything. They're the brain rehearsing the act of consciousness itself, and that thought, that you've been dreaming since before you drew your first breath, that your brain was running these simulations in the warm darkness of the womb, bootstrapping consciousness from nothing. That thought carries you toward sleep with a kind of gravity all its own. You've been doing this your whole life. Every night. Thousands and thousands of nights. Each one different. Each one the same in its basic architecture. The descent through the stages. The slow wave depths. The REM ascent. The stories, the emotions, the bizarre logic, the vivid imagery. All of it, turning like a wheel, night after night, year after year, quietly, reliably, without any effort from you at all. So let it happen. Let the thinking slow. Let the images come. If they don't make sense, that's fine. They're not supposed to. Not in the way your waking mind insists that things should make sense. The dreaming mind has its own logic, associative rather than linear, emotional rather than rational, driven by resemblance and feeling rather than cause and effect. And that logic, strange as it is doing important work. It's sorting through the day. It's filing what matters and releasing what doesn't. It's connecting things that seemed separate and separating things that seemed connected. It's rehearsing, imagining, processing, creating. And in the morning, when you open your eyes and the room assembles itself around you, solid, predictable, obeying the rules that dreams so cheerfully ignore, you might remember a fragment of what happened in the night. A face, a feeling, a place you recognize but can't quite name. Hold it gently. It's a souvenir from a world your brain built just for you. A world that existed for a few minutes in the small hours of the night, and then dissolved, as all dreams do, into the light of ordinary waking consciousness. It was real while it lasted, as real as anything. Your brain doesn't know the difference, and in that strange fact lies one of the most profound truths in all of neuroscience. That reality, as you experience it, is always a construction, always a model, always a dream of a different kind. The universe gave you a brain that builds worlds. During the day, it builds the world you navigate and act in. At night, it builds the worlds you visit in dreams. Both are extraordinary. Both are constructed by the same astonishing 3-pound organ that sits behind your eyes, running on about 20 watts of power, processing more information than any machine ever built. And right now, that organ is winding down. The waking world is receding. The internal world is brightening. You're crossing over. And the last thought to carry with you, as you let the current take you, is this: every human being who has ever lived has done what you're about to do. Every person who ever lay down in a cave, or a hut, or a palace, or a trench, or a hospital bed, or a space station, every one of them closed their eyes and crossed this same threshold, descended through the same stages, entered the same strange country of dreams. It is one of the oldest and most universal human experiences, this nightly journey inward, this letting go of the external world and trusting the internal one. We've been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years, long before we understood anything about brains or neurons or REM sleep or neurotransmitters. And we'll keep doing it, tonight and every night. Because the dreaming brain doesn't wait for understanding. It just does its work, quietly, patiently, in the dark, while you rest. So rest. Let the questions settle. Let the science fade into the background. Like music you can hear, but don't need to follow. Your brain knows what it's doing. It's been doing it since before you were born. And tonight, like every night, it will take you somewhere you've never been, show you something you didn't expect, and bring you back in the morning, a little different, a little refreshed, carrying memories you might not even know you have, from a place that was entirely, impossibly, beautifully yours. Sleep well, dream well. Your brain is already starting.